So last time we ended up taking a look at a $170 mini PC versus a $270 mini PC. And well, this mini PC right here, the BOSGAME P5 was available for $270 when I was making that video. At this point, it's gone up $20, but it always fluctuates within that price range. Sometimes it'll be $270, sometimes it'll be $280, sometimes it'll be $290. It really does depend on when you look at these things, and that's the entirety of the mini PC market in general. So right now on Amazon, this is a $290 mini PC, and I'm going to be comparing it up against what is one tier above it, and that is the GMKtec M7. This is the non-pro version, which means it's rocking the Ryzen 7 6850H. And this is one of the best value mini PCs that you can get within its price category. It is under $400, and it is one of the best options currently available with a full kit. Though if you stay tuned, I will let you know on how you can get this mini PC for less than $260. But let's just jump right on in. So the first thing that I want to talk about with these two mini PCs is, of course, talking about the hardware and what we're working with here. Of course, on the BOSGAME P5, we are looking at a Ryzen 5 6600H. Both of these are 6000 series from AMD. So that means we are looking at Zen 3 Plus for the CPU and RDNA2 for the GPU. But obviously the configuration of both of those things is different on either one. On the Ryzen 5 6600H, we're looking at 6 Zen 3 Plus cores with 12 threads. And on the GPU side of things, we're looking at the Radeon 660M. So that's 6 RDNA2 cores, and that has a maximum clock speed of 1.9 gigahertz. That is paired with 24 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gigabyte SSD. All in all, it's a very compact package and is packing a decent amount of power in a very small package. Now, when we compare that to the M7 here from GMKtec, we are looking at the Ryzen 7 6850H, which is just a pro variant of the 6800H. So same core configuration, same GPU, it's just a pro model. Does that really mean anything to you? Not really. There's very little difference between the pro and non-pro versions of these processors. Usually pro tends to mean that it comes with some more business oriented things, and I mean business oriented things like stuff that your IT department cares about, but the vast majority of people are not going to care about. But that doesn't mean that the chip itself is bad. The 6850H is a decently powerful chip since it is 8 RDNA 3 Plus cores and 12 RDNA 2 cores. So we're looking at 2 cores extra on the CPU side of things and 6 extra cores on the GPU. The GPU is really what has the largest difference here. And of course, this does also come with 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gigabyte SSD. In terms of dimensions for these two systems, there is a pretty noticeable size difference. So let's take a look at the bodies of these systems. If we take a look at the front, immediately this is where one of the biggest differences between the two systems becomes apparent. For one, the size difference, of course, becomes very apparent here, as the M7 is a much taller, chunkier device. But when we look at the I/O, we are looking at the dual USBs in the front, we are looking at the headphone jack in the front and the power button, but the differences with the M7 is the USB 4 port in the front as well as an Oculink port. So what this means is that we can use external PCIe devices with the GMKtec device here. Now, how useful is that really on a day-to-day basis? It's tough to say, really. I get that there's a lot of people out there that really enjoy eGPU setups, but so far they seem very gimmicky to me. After trying out a few graphics cards with this system, while the performance bump is very welcome in comparison to the iGPU, the actual setup itself looks so jank and it just seems so inconvenient and pretty much defeats the whole purpose of a mini PC in the first place that it makes it a tough recommend. Though it does have some neat features to it where you can use any kind of PCIe device. You know, we all always think about Oculink in terms of graphics cards, but there are a lot of different PCIe devices that you can plug in and get working. So it does give you some added flexibility there, but whether or not that'll be useful to you really just depends on your workload. So that might be a selling point to you, that might be completely irrelevant. Now, of course, we saw the tops of the devices, and I will talk about their cooling systems. The BOSGAME P5 does have top ventilation here. There is a fan underneath there that is in charge of cooling everything, and I really wish they didn't have this plastic shroud that's covering what the cooling is supposed to be here. I get that it makes it look nicer, but I would prefer a focus on performance over aesthetics. Now, the GMKtec here is one where I both love and hate what they've done here. I love that they have this gigantic fan at the top. It does a great great job of cooling the RAM and SSDs that are down there. And keep in mind that the cooling system up here for the BOSGAME is cooling the CPU. What the top fan here is doing is just cooling down the RAM and the SSD, since you can access it from here. If we flip over to the bottom, it's the opposite scenarios for each one, where this is the cooling system for the actual CPU and GPU, which is just the APU down there. And this fan right here is what's cooling the RAM and the SSD. Just a completely different layout in general. Both systems seem to do a perfectly fine job of keeping cool, though the P5 does end up hitting some higher temperatures. I don't consider this to be a fault because it's well within the tolerance range of the APU itself. These APUs are designed to work all the way up to 105 Celsius, so being somewhere in the 80s or maybe even in the 90s would not be a problem. As long as thermal throttling isn't happening, I don't really care too much. I will say though that the GMKtec, because of its larger size in general, does have better cooling. And of course it is going to need it because we are looking at doubling of the GPU size and we are looking at more CPU cores. But in general, both of them do a good job of cooling the hardware that they have in there, so no complaints there for any of it. I've never noticed any throttling on the RAM on either system, which is really what you're looking for. One of the downsides of the M7 here though is the fact that they use this acrylic plastic shroud at the top, and I am constantly just having to clean it because if you ever commit a crime, this thing will snitch on you. They will be able to get your entire fingerprint off of this thing. So, you know, if you're out there doing anything nefarious, this is not the system for you to get. Unless you're also burning off your fingerprints, in which case, you know, you're just gonna have to deal with the oil stains that remain. But I really wish they would have just gone with a mesh top that was something more durable, though there is spacing there to let air in, and it does do a more than adequate job. I mean, we're just cooling the RAM and the SSD there. It doesn't need to be anything crazy, though I do appreciate that they went with a larger fan for this because smaller fans tend to make some noise. The fan down here, because it's very tiny, does make some noise, though because it's down like this, it doesn't really end up being much of a problem. But it is one of those things where if it was at the top and it was a tiny fan like this, it would end up being a problem. This thing, dead silent because of its size. So overall, great choices there. Of course, we look at the side, we are looking at ventilation. Again, you can see the girth difference between these two systems. On both sides, it is ventilation, but now we take a look at another interesting part, and that is the back I/O. So of course, on both systems, we have the DC barrel jack. We end up seeing two USB-Cs on the back for the P5, though we have only one USB 4 at the back for the M7. It is a USB 4. So that is faster bandwidth, and it's pretty much a full function port. We are looking at 2.5 gigabit LAN on both systems, though the M7 has two of them. That might not matter to you. This might be a selling point for you. If you're using this as a router device, this is really, really nice to have, especially since it's 2.5 gigabit. But even if you're not using it in that kind of scenario, if you plug in both of these ports, pretty much every modern operating system understands how these work and will essentially utilize them both at the same time. So you can have an effective bandwidth of 5 gigabit. So not too bad. But again, it might be a selling point for you. It might just mean nothing. Now, in terms of display outputs, we are looking at 2 HDMI on the P5. That's more than fine. But I do like the inclusion of the display port on the M7. There's just a lot of displays out there that are a few years older that were in that awkward transition phase where HDMI wasn't really able to keep up with display ports. So there would be some displays where if you used an HDMI port, you would be capped at how high of a refresh rate you can use, while display port, you could pretty much get the full capability of the display. If you have a modern display with HDMI 2.1, this is likely not to be a problem for you at all. And even HDMI 2 handles that perfectly fine, but it's really just the older versions of HDMI. And look, a lot of us keep our displays for a very long time. I have monitors that I've had for almost 10 years now. They still work perfectly fine. They're just outdated in terms of spec, and that can be a problem sometimes. So having DisplayPort really solves a lot of those issues. It's a pretty specific scenario whether or not that will matter to you, but you could always use an HDMI to DisplayPort adapter if you needed to, but that is an issue that you might run into here. Now in the back, we are also looking at USB ports, but these are just 2.0 ports. They aren't high bandwidth by any means, but they're great for your peripheral. So in terms of the I/O layout, I do like the fact that both of the USB-Cs are on the back on the P5. I don't usually like to keep things plugged into the front, which is one of the issues that I also have with the Oculink port. It's that you now have a cable coming out from the front that is already a pretty pretty inconvenient thing to have. It's not exactly the most aesthetically pleasing thing to have a cable coming out from your mini PC to hook up to a graphics card in general, but having it come out from the front makes it even worse. Same with the USB 4.0 that is in the front. That USB-C is very difficult to use because it's just coming out of the front. I prefer having them in the back. I think that was a smart move on the P5. But in general, both systems have I/O that I think is more than adequate enough for the vast majority of people, especially people that are buying mini PCs. That being said, the M7 just has more that you can do with it because of the inclusion of the Oculink, the inclusion of USB 4, and the inclusion of dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet jacks while still having a USB-C in the back. So before we jump into the performance testing, I do want to just run down on just how these systems are configured for this testing. So on both systems, we are going to be using 4 gigabytes of VRAM allocated to the iGPU. This is not done for performance reasons. This is done because of the fact that games will sometimes not launch if you have less than 4 gigabytes of allocated RAM. It will very, very, very rarely affect performance in any capacity. Almost always, it's just to go past a artificial barrier. Allocating more VRAM will pretty much never lead to better performance. APUs are just smart enough to allocate as much RAM as VRAM as they'll ever need. The issue is that because the system will detect less than 4 gigabytes of RAM when you're trying to launch certain games, it might stop you from doing anything, or it might lock away certain graphics settings. So allocating more VRAM can help with that, but chances are for a lot of those graphics settings that get locked away, you probably won't be able to utilize them, though sometimes turning up your textures won't really have any impact on performance. So 4 gigabytes of RAM is about the recommended amount that I have for allocation. You certainly could allocate 8 gigabytes or 16 if you wanted to, but there just really is no reason to. So with 4 gigabytes allocated on each system, we are looking at 20 gigabytes of system RAM available here, and we are looking at 28 gigabytes of system RAM available on the M7. Besides that, both of them are running the same version of Windows, so that is Windows 11 24H2, and both of them are patched up to the most recent February patch for Windows. And besides that, both of them, because they are AMD APUs, are running on the exact same graphics drivers, that being the new 25.3.1 drivers. So we're going to be taking a look at both of these systems running on some games, and we are going to look at some CPU benchmarks as well. In terms of the games testing, I'm splitting it up into 2 groups. So group 1 is going to be 5 games that have built-in benchmarks so that we can have consistent scenarios on both of them for the most accurate comparison between the two. And then we're going to do 5 games that don't have built-in benchmark, and the testing scenario is a lot more inconsistent. You know, a lot of games that have multiplayer will just not let you choose a map to play on or anything like that, so you pretty much end up playing on a random map with random scenarios. So it's a lot less accurate for a head-to-head comparison, but there's still popular enough titles that I would like to demonstrate them on both systems. So I'm just prefacing that just in case, but it should still give you a general idea of the overall performance difference. So I realized my microphone was off for this section here, but I did record the internals as well of both systems here just so you can see. Obviously both of them are using DDR5, but the GMKtec has 32 gigabytes of RAM and the P5 has 24 gigabytes of RAM. You can also see the size difference in the fans on both systems. But one of the key differences here is the fact that while both of them do have secondary M.2 slots for an SSD, the P5 unfortunately has a smaller, I believe it's a 2242 NVMe slot, and that really limits your expandability. Those SSDs tend to cap out at 2 terabytes. I've never seen any that are bigger than that. And so while you do have the main full-size slot, so you can put up to an 8 terabyte SSD there if you wanted to, you can't have the secondary be something like a 4 terabyte. Of course, 2 terabytes might be perfectly fine for you, but I do like the extra expandability, and that's one of the big benefits of the M7, where you get the 2 full-size NVMe slots. So you could have a theoretical maximum of 16 terabytes, but a more realistic maximum of about 8 terabytes. Outside of that, though, you can see the physical dimension differences between the two. And again, the much smaller fan on the P5 can potentially be an issue in terms of noise. I haven't found it to be very noisy at all, but it does make more noise than the M7 does at idle. It's not distractingly loud by any means, but it is something thing that you should be aware of. So starting off the game test, we're going to be taking a look at Civilization 6 with the turn time test, and this is with the Rising Storm DLC, so it has a more intensive test. And as you can see here, we are running the game on both systems at the lowest in-game graphics settings. I just wanted to essentially maximize the performance on this as much as possible. And after 3 runs, interestingly enough, the 6600H did consistently come out ahead, but for about a half second at most, really. They hovered at roughly the same number most of the time, but the 6600H did end up coming out on top on all 3 of those tests. So very interesting result there, but it doesn't really mean anything because the number is just not that substantial. If we were looking at even a 5-second difference, I would maybe consider it a more definitive win. But not even a full second is one of those things where it's more of a margin of error type thing. But both of these do give great results, especially in comparison to the N150. But these two do end up scoring very similar to each other because of the fact that they're based off of the same architecture. They're both Zen 3 Plus. So the only real difference between the cores is just the fact that they have different clock speeds, and that seems to not have mattered all that much in this scenario. And the next game that we're taking a look at is Black Myth Wukong, running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at 66% resolution scaling. And both are also running with frame generation on, and it becomes pretty clear that only the 680M is going to give you a decent experience here. See, frame generation at such a low FPS can be pretty brutal. The ghosting becomes very obvious. The artifacts in general become pretty obvious in the game itself when you don't have a more predictable scenario like this. Still, if it's your choice between not being able to play the game at all or you want to be able to play through it, you can do it on both systems, though it's drastically different experiences. We are looking at about a 54 and 56% increase on both the 1% lows and the FPS average. That's a pretty massive jump in performance, and as you can see, it goes from being around a 30 FPS experience to a just below 60 FPS experience. All around, not a bad showing for either system considering what they are at what price points they're at, but we are also using frame generation here, which means it's not exactly going to feel the same as playing at 30 FPS or at 60 FPS, though it is surprisingly close and it does make it pretty playable, but you are going to notice more ghosting and artifacting on the P5 here. So the next game that I took a look at is Hitman World of Assassination, one of my favorite games to play, and here we're running the built-in benchmark. In terms of graphics settings on both systems, it's a mixture of medium and high graphics settings. It's essentially what it defaulted to for the 680M, and I decided to use the same settings across both systems just to see how they would compare like that, though we are using FSR at the quality preset as well. And as you can see, the difference here is a lot more narrow than it was with the previous game. We end up seeing a 25% increase on the FPS average, but absolutely no movement at all with the 1% lows, effectively negating that performance increase for the most part. It just means that there's a wider fluctuation happening there with the M7 that I just don't think is going to be all that great of an experience if you look at just the FPS number. The 1% lows really paint a picture there, and you can tell by the frame times that it is seemingly struggling a bit more, in the sense that because it goes to a higher FPS but it drops down to those 1% lows that are identical to the P5, there's just a lot more fluctuation going on there. In the actual missions though, both systems are more than playable, especially if you're very accustomed to a 30 FPS average. Both systems are going to do a great job giving you that, and you can always start to turn down more graphics settings to boost up your performance. These were some pretty aggressive settings, but I was kind of more amused by the fact that it thought that the 680M would be able to handle that perfectly. And for the most part, it is doing that. It is playable. It's just not the most ideal. So the next game that I took a look at is Counter-Strike 2, running with the built-in benchmark. And here it is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings on both systems, though we are not using FSR at all. FSR is completely disabled. Do not use it in this game unless you're in the most desperate of scenarios. And we do see a pretty healthy bump in the FPS average, where we see about a 26% increase. But really, the more meaningful meaningful upgrade ended up coming with the 1% lows that ended up seeing a 44% increase. That's a pretty significant jump, and increases in your 1% lows are going to be far more meaningful than increases in your FPS average, since it reduces the fluctuation of your FPS. And after actually playing on both systems, I do think that the M7 just provides a better gaming experience in this title, but neither one is going to be a deal breaker. So the next title that we're taking a look at is Returnal, here running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR, but it's FSR at the quality preset. And as you can see, neither system is really doing a great job here. This is one of those titles that I love to test, especially on these types of machines, because it really brings down mini PCs like this to their knees. You have to get really aggressive with your FSR settings to even get a playable experience here, but there are some notable increases going with the 680M, though they're mostly superficial since it's not going to lead to you being able to play the game properly. But we do see a 37% increase in the FPS average, and we do see a 46% increase in the 1% lows. Again, this isn't going to translate to you having a better gaming experience at all. Both of them are pretty much in unplayable territory unless you're very, very desperate to play this title, but it does demonstrate the increase in performance going with the 680M. But now we're done with all of the games with built-in benchmarks, and we're going to be taking a look at some of the games that I just wanted to try out. And here we have Marvel Rivals running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the quality preset. And again, neither title is really giving you a great experience, especially for a title like this. There's a lot of games that you can get away with playing at 30 FPS, but I think that a competitive shooter game like this is just not going to be all that great at below 60 FPS, and especially with 1% lows at the range that they're at. Though we do end up seeing about a 30% increase in the FPS average. All of that is negated when you see the fact that the 1% lows increased only 4.5%, in other words, by one whole FPS. So again, not the most ideal situation here for sitting down and really playing the game, but for the purposes of comparison, you can see that there is an increase in performance, though not a very meaningful one. So after testing out Marvel Rivals, I did want to try out something that is a lot more high FPS. And well, we're taking a look at Combat Master, which is a very, very ridiculous Call of Duty clone. But it's extremely fast-paced, and because it is developed to be a mobile game first, it performs really great on the vast majority of hardware that you try it out. So running at the ultra graphics settings, you can see that both systems are getting triple-digit FPS averages, though the P5 is barely able to do that at only 102, but that's still more than enough to be able to play the game comfortably. So what we're looking at here is a 50% increase in our FPS average, and we're looking at a 36% increase in our 1% lows. Overall, that does mean that the M7 is going to be a smoother gaming experience. You are going to be able to utilize a high refresh rate display to its full capacity, unless it's a 240 Hz display, but both are great gaming experiences. So the next title that I wanted to take a look at is Risk of Rain, running with the lowest in-game graphics settings except for the textures. Those are set to full. And the reason I wanted to take a look at this title is because being a 3D indie title, or I guess you could say formally indie, because I don't think something published by Gearbox should be considered indie, but being the type of title that it is, they tend to be not exactly super well optimized, though being more simplistic in their design, they can be good performers on these types of machines, but it's not always guaranteed. And as you can see here, there certainly are some issues, though it is more than playable on both systems. But with 1% lows that are at 43, it's clear that the P5 isn't going to give you the most consistent above 60 FPS gaming experience. Still, FPS averages of 76 are pretty decent. But we do end up seeing a 38% increase in the FPS average and a 55% increase in the 1% lows, going from the P5 to the M7. So that's a pretty massive increase, and one of the biggest benefits is the fact that the 1% lows see the biggest boost. That means you're going to have the smoothest experience, and that really matters for this type of game because of the fact that as you get into the later rounds and as you start to use different modifiers, there can be a lot of enemies on the screen and a lot of effects. So having that extra performance headroom can really help you out in those super demanding scenarios. It's kind of hard to recreate that on a whim without spending about 3 hours playing each game, but having some performance headroom room can really help out in this title and similar titles to it. But I would not say that either one of these systems is a bad experience by any means. So the next title that I decided to take a look at is Helldivers 2, running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using the resolution scaling at ultra quality. And well, what this does for us in terms of performance is not exactly perfect. Both systems were really a drag to play on, though the P5 was especially bad. But as you can see by those 1% lows, neither system was really having a great time here. So while we do see a 52% increase in the FPS average and a 40% increase in the 1% lows, it doesn't mean much of anything. I did not have a good time playing on either one of these systems, and I just wanted the missions to end as soon as possible. I personally could not sit down and play like this. Maybe if you're willing to sacrifice on the resolution and things like that, but we are already using resolution scaling here, so it's not running at native 1080p and it's struggling a lot. So really just not ideal at all. And well, the final game that I wanted to take a look at is Spider-Man 2, which just recently came out. And we are running this with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR, but it's FSR set to quality. I didn't want to go super aggressive with the FSR settings because this game does suffer pretty tremendously from ghosting. It does not have frame generation enabled, however. And really the main reason that I didn't do that was because those 1% lows are absolutely abysmal. Neither system is going to give you a great experience here at all, though we do see a pretty massive increase in those FPS averages. It doesn't amount to much of anything, and neither does the increase in the 1% lows. I mean, to call that an increase is pretty laughable in and of itself. So it's just not going to be a playable game, which is true for both systems. So if we jump right on into these Cinebench numbers, you can see what the results are like. If we take a look at the Ryzen 7 6850H, you can see that we get a multi-core score of 11,986 versus the 8,981 from the 6600H. So that is a pretty decent jump, but it goes along with the fact that it does have 2 extra cores, and that means it has overall 4 extra threads. So not a very surprising result, and if we take a look at where exactly they fall in line, they're pretty much within the range of what would be their competitors. So neither one is giving a surprising result, and it's really in line with what you would expect to see here. So whether or not that extra multi-core performance matters to you is really going to depend on the type of workload that you're doing. But if we take a look at the single core performance, you can see that the 6850H ends up scoring 1,591 versus the 1,466 for the 6600H. So again, not massively different results, and they should fall in line with the fact that these are the same architecture, but there are just slight clock speed differences, and that's what makes up the difference here. In real world use, unless you're doing some heavy workloads, you're more than likely not going to run into a CPU bottleneck with each of these systems. But if you are trying to maximize your single core performance, then the 6850H in the M7 is just a better way to go. But again, no massive leaps in performance increase here. They fall in line with what you would realistically expect to see here, with again going from a 6-core to an 8-core from the same generation. Still great results by 2025 standards, and at the price point that these systems come out at, it is some pretty top performance. So after seeing the performance of both of these systems compared to each other, I hope that you understand what I meant in the previous video where we looked at a $170 mini PC versus a $270 mini PC. There is just no other price category of mini PC where a $100 difference gives you 3 to 4 times more performance. What we saw here in terms of gaming is about a 30 to at most 50% increase in performance between these two systems here for $100. And in terms of the CPU performance, the single core difference is really just minuscule enough that you will realistically not notice it, and the multi-core performance is about in line with what you would expect to see here. So think about a 20% increase. Now that's not to say that it isn't worthwhile if this falls in line with what you want, and again, it's not all about raw performance. The hardware that you're dealing with here does also matter. You know, the differences in the I/O, the differences in size. A smaller system might be more appealing to you, while having a bigger one with better cooling and more powerful hardware and I/O might be more appealing to you for $100. If you're looking for a day-to-day system, I think that the P5 is pretty hard to beat, and all other systems that are rocking a 6600H are pretty great value right now in the market. But the 6850H does end up giving you a nice bump in performance for $100 while still getting a complete kit. But I did mention earlier that there is a way to get the GMKtec for cheaper, and that's if you go onto AliExpress. AliExpress, you can buy these things bare bones, and you can buy them directly from GMKtec bare bones as well, but you can go onto AliExpress and buy these things bare bones, and it ends up coming at a cheaper price than the P5. The GMKtec is about as good as it gets when it comes to the price point, because you end up paying around $250 at most for the bare bones unit, and if you can get yourself some cheap RAM and cheap SSD, AliExpress has that as well, you can get this thing set up for a very, very good value. I mean, we are dealing with a 512 gigabyte SSD that comes on this kit for less than $400. You will likely be able to find 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD for around this price or maybe even cheaper. And if you want to go with a smaller SSD, then you can save some money there. The P5, on the other hand, you can buy directly from Amazon at a great price, and you'll pretty much get it the next day. While the GMKtec still being a decent price on Amazon, if you want to go down the bare bones route, you definitely can on AliExpress for a very decent price. But overall, within this price category, it really comes down to what you're doing. For 99% of computer users out there, I don't think they need more than a P5. But if you know the workloads that you have require more memory, or you're going to need more storage, or the better IO on the M7 is something that will matter to you, then for an extra $100, this doesn't seem like a bad deal at all. And especially if you're willing to go down the bare bones route. Because if you're like me, you're probably willing to hunt around on Facebook Marketplace, on OfferUp, on pretty much any deal site that you can find out there to find a good new or used pair of RAM and SSD to go along with this thing to try to maximize your dollar here. But let me know what you think of both of these systems down below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.